Our sermon text this morning is from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 9 through 18. Listen for the word of the Lord. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I watched them because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned in the fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. I approached one of the attendants to ask him the truth concerning this. So he said that he would disclose to me the interpretation of the matter. As for these 4 great beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth, but the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Douglas Adams's fairly popular novel, The Hitchhiker's Guide from the Galaxy, published in 1979, popularized the phrase, "Don't panic." It's a science fiction novel based on the concept that there are travel guide writers going throughout the galaxy to write a sort of a travel guide for space travelers. And that the book is so large and complicated to use that the words "Don't panic" have to be printed on the cover, so that to keep the potential readers from getting too excited. I bring this up, not because I'm going to talk about the book again in the sermon, but because as I was reading these passages from Daniel and Revelation, I almost felt like I should write "Don't panic" on the bulletin cover. Because they're a little alarming, right? They are kind of scary. I realized that even mentioning Revelation is enough to scare some people. And usually when we talk about Daniel, we skip over the second half with all these visions. Today's passage especially, with its scary, misshapen beasts with talking horns, and the fire, and the kings coming on the clouds, sounds like some stories I've heard about hallucinations being brought on by chemical withdrawal. Add that to the fact that today is Christ the King Sunday, and some of you are probably a little worried that I'm going to preach a fire and brimstone sermon about the world ending this week. Most mainline Protestants deal with this anxiety by ignoring these passages. Mostly because our ideas of kings come from Disney movies or Braveheart or fairy tales. And we're Americans and we don't really buy into kings anyway. And as for these visions of cosmic warfare and judgment, we're more comfortable with leaving them to the street preachers because we figure people like that have played out these passages already. And after all, isn't life scary enough without the fire and brimstone? Anyone that watches the news will probably say yes. But the fact of the matter is that these passages are in the Bible, and as Presbyterians, of course, we say that we give the Bible authority, so these passages being there, we have to wrestle with them until we begin to understand what the writers are telling us. So this week, before we jump into the more joyful time of Advent, I'm going to wade into this passage from Daniel. Seriously, though, don't panic. Daniel's visions are pointing us to not the end times, but to the reality of a God who rules the universe and became one of us, to show us that the suffering and violence of this world aren't the only reality there is. The fire and the monsters and all the rest of that might be scary, but the Ancient One on his throne and the one like a human being, sometimes that phrase is rendered Son of Man, are on our side. And they're capable of keeping all the rest of it in its proper place. Most readers of the Bible are scared of passages like today's because they don't really understand what biblical apocalypse represents. Modern readers have been too indoctrinated by scary movies and end-time prophecies to see what the biblical writers are actually trying to tell us. An apocalypse isn't necessarily the end of time. It's a revelation of sorts, hence the English title of the book, Revelation. It's a pulling aside of the veil between this world that we live in and the spiritual realm where God is, so that we can look into the spiritual realm beyond the reality that we live in every day and see how that spiritual realm affects us. So it's not just end-time prophecy. It's not showing us what's going to happen, the horrors that are coming in the future. So no, you're not going to get anything today about President Obama being the Antichrist, as a coworker once told me. Daniel is really showing us God's sovereignty and God's activity in this world now. And how this world, as much as it resists God and tries to make itself God, is still subject to the God that created everything. Today's passage is, on one level, reacting against oppressive empires. In the time when this book was written, several empires, first the Babylonians, then the Persians, and then the Greek Empire, had successively dominated the Near East. They demanded heavy taxation. They denied the God of Israel, and they set themselves up as rulers or gods. In that time, of course, it was common for a king or an earthly power to call himself, usually himself, a god of some kind. These days, earthly rulers don't always tell us that they're gods, but look at some of our celebrities. Look at some of our politicians. They often think of themselves as godlike. The imagery isn't meant to scare us. This isn't a horror movie. It's to show us, on the one hand, that humankind is made in God's image. It shows us God on a throne having authority over the universe. And the fact that one like a man is given rulership shows us that humankind is given priority in this universe. It's not the It's not the institutions or the political systems or anything else that we set up that is important to God, but our humanity, that image of God that's in each and every one of us. On the other hand, we're shown earthly powers setting themselves up as gods, excuse me, and in the process distorting and perverting human purpose and denying God's reality. And so the message isn't that God is coming back soon to smite us. The message is that God is here among us, already trying to redeem us. God's image, Daniel is telling us, is stamped in every one of us. Humankind's connection to God and subjection to God should be honored, not denied. We can either nurture that image of God in every person, or we can deny it or seek to break it. Nations and institutions come and go. Oppression institutions that lift humans up, that seek to honor that image of God in each of us. Well, they're held up as being good to an extent. Nations or institutions that oppress or mistreat humans, that deny the importance of every single person, are subject to God's judgment. Either way, we're reminded that every nation and every institution that we hold as important is finite. And so rather than seeing dire predictions of horror and suffering to come, we're asked to see in Daniel's vision God's presence in our world and Christ's unity with both God and with us, and God's hope that each of us and all of the nations and the institutions that we set up will honor God's image in people. Cut to the world today. The Babylonians and the Persians, and the Greek Empire are long since gone. We've got our own political systems now. But of course, oppression and warfare and everything else that scares us and causes us anxiety make us think that God, being concerned with us, may be vague or abstract. Our world is still filled with violence and racism, and with efforts either to promote them or to address them. We've had quite a bit of that coming up in our presidential campaigns. I don't always talk about politics, but sometimes politics do overlap with our faith. It seems that many of our leaders have taken as a given that our country and our institutions are the be-all and end-all that we need to protect. And many of us have kind of bought into that. We've had debates over things like policing, terrorism, what to do with refugees. This passage today calls our personal priorities and our national priorities into question. What is it that we hold important? What's really important to us as Christians? Some would say national security, or securing the borders, or lifting up certain traditions that we have in this country. The Bible challenges us to look beyond loyalties to political parties or to certain traditions or certain ways of doing things. What Daniel says is really important to pay attention to is lifting up people, caring for people, nurturing humanity in every person and nurturing humanity in general. We're asked to remember that all of our earthly powers are finite. There are passages in the Bible that talk about respecting human authority, respecting the people that are set in power over us. And I think that's true to an extent. We do need to respect authorities for society to hold together. But I think we're called to remember also what the Bible tells us is important. We're called to remember that God created everything. And it's to God that we go back to in the end. And so, we have to ask ourselves, are we lifting up people? Are we caring for people? Or are we letting fear and anxiety divide us and pull us apart? All of us are subject to God in the end. And so we're asked to look at how we can be faithful to God and care for one another above and beyond any loyalties to countries or institutions or any of that. And so this affects many areas of our lives. It can affect how we vote. It can affect even how we look at people around us. Do we see threats? Do we see problems to be fixed? Or do we see people who God loves and wants to redeem and wants to see loved by us? If we start there, other problems around us might actually start to be addressed.